Hey guys! Today we'll be covering a 2022 romance drama film called Persuasion. At the age of 19, Anne Elliot fell madly in love with a sailor, Frederick Wentworth, and wanted to marry him. However, she was persuaded to give up on him as he was just a sailor, and she, a lady, the daughter of Sir Walter Elliot, who was one of the wealthiest men in the state. 8 years later, Anne is still single, depressed, and craving love and romance. Loneliness has led her to drinking habits. Although she rejected Frederick after being convinced by others, she could never forget about him and move on in life. Anne's father, Walter, who is self-obsessed, lives a lavish and vain life in his mansion. One thing he loves more than himself is spending money. Also, Anne has two sisters. The elder one, Elizabeth, is a lofty and dominating personality, whereas her younger sister, Mary, is already married to Charles, an heir of upper-cross state. Anne's mother died several years ago, and she and her sisters were brought up by a mistress named Lady Russell. Anne is a very warm and compassionate lady who cares for everyone around her. However, her father and sisters underestimate her and don't consider her happiness. In the following scene, we find out that Walter's impulsive and extravagant spending habits have led him to the brink of bankruptcy. One day, the debt collector seizes belongings from the mansion, since Walter has not paid them for a long time. Left with no options, Lady Russell and Mr. Shepherd, the attorney and financial advisor, suggest Walter downsize to a more suitable residence for the time being and relocate to Bath. The idea of leaving their mansion and moving to another city doesn't really interest Walter. However, when Shepherd mentions that a Navy officer named Admiral Croft is ready to pay a handsome rent for the mansion, he agrees. Turns out that Admiral Croft is the brother-in-law of Frederick. Hearing about Frederick makes Anne upset, and she goes to her room. Later, Russell heads to Anne's room and finds her crying over Frederick. It is revealed that Russell was the one who dissuaded Anne from marrying him because of his occupation and status. Meanwhile, Anne mentions her regret for breaking his heart, despite loving him madly. She mentions that Frederick was the only one who understood her and loved her for who she is. When Russell explains that his status wasn't acceptable, Anne interrupts her saying Frederick is now a captain and rich. However, she has not heard from him, seemingly because she broke his heart. Hearing all this, Russell asks her to let it go and move on in life. After she leaves the room, Anne looks at all the letters and gifts from Frederick that she has stored like a treasure. Not only that, she has also collected newspaper articles mentioning Frederick's naval achievements. Since he is not married yet, despite all the achievements, Anne still hopes they'll be together someday. The following morning during breakfast, Walter discusses their relocation to Bath and asks Shepherd's daughter, Penelope, to join them. Here, we learn that Penelope is a widow and she is set on marrying Walter. Meanwhile, Elizabeth asks Anne to visit her sister Mary, who is ill and needs help. After breakfast, Walter and Elizabeth leave for their new house in Bath, while Anne stays back to attend to the tenants and show them around the mansion. Later, when she meets Croft and his wife, she mentions that she knows Mrs. Croft's brother, Frederick, quite well. After a bit of chattering, she hands the mansion over to the tenants and leaves for Mary's house. On the way, Anne is skeptical if Frederick still has feelings for her because he must be mad at her. Later, she visits Mary, who is narcissistic and vapid. She constantly complains about her unidentifiable ailment, rallies against her husband, and assaults her in-laws. Not only that, she thinks her two sons are monsters who play around the house and make it messy. As Mary whines about her so-called never-ending sufferings, her two sister-in-laws, Louisa and Henrietta, interrupt her. The girls are excited to see Anne and ask her to spend and enjoy all her time with them. Afterwards, Mary's husband Charles arrives and informs them that they'll be having guests for a dinner party that includes Admiral Croft, his wife, and Frederick. The thought of seeing Frederick makes Anne excited as well as anxious. Meanwhile, Louisa, who is very fond of Anne, suggests she pursue Frederick as she needs a man in her life now. Sadly, she stays back at home and doesn't attend the dinner party when Mary's son hurts his arm after falling from a tree. Despite being the mother, Mary insists on attending the dinner rather than looking after her kid. The following morning during breakfast, when Louisa mentions Frederick, Anne puts a breadbasket on her head, makes a mustache with the jam, and mimics him. Just then, Frederick arrives and sees Anne. They are both stunned to see each other after so long. Upon being asked by Charles, Frederick sarcastically mentions that he knew Anne before he was rich. Later that evening, Anne joins everyone for dinner. Louisa insists she sit next to Frederick, but the latter becomes nervous and refuses. As Louisa and Frederick get along, Anne gets envious. During the dinner, someone asks Frederick why he chose a risky profession, to which he replies that he needed a distraction from despair caused by a woman he loved. However, he doesn't mention the name. Afterwards, Anne plays piano and gloomily watches her ex-boyfriend dance with Louisa. The next day, while Anne thinks about Frederick's cold politeness from the previous night, Mary arrives and disappoints her even more by revealing that Frederick might propose to Louisa. Later, Anne approaches Mary's sons and spends some time with them. While they are playing and acting themselves as warriors, the kids get carried away and start beating Anne. Just then, Frederick arrives and stops the boys. But before he can leave, Anne asks him if he's still hungry. Surprisingly, Frederick replies that he's too kind for her and suffered a lot in the past. The following day, Anne, Mary, and her sister-in-laws go for a walk in the woods. On the way, Louisa reveals to Anne that she is falling in love with Frederick. She also mentions that she wants to confess her feelings to him as soon as possible. Anne, who always cares for others' happiness, replies that she'd be pleased to see Louisa happy with Frederick. After a while, they are joined by Charles and Frederick. In the next scene, Frederick and Louisa stay home and talk about Mary's constant complaining. When Louisa mentions that Anne is the sweetest among the Elliot family and how she wished her to be Charles's wife, Frederick doesn't agree with her. He describes Anne as having as much pride as the rest of her family and just pretends to be nice. Meanwhile, Anne, who has been eavesdropping on them, is upset about Frederick's perception of her. When she tries to walk away, she trips and hurts her leg. After reaching home, a distressed Anne hugs one of her nephews tightly. Just then, Mary arrives and informs her that all of them are going to Lyme to spend the next few days there. The following day at Lyme, Frederick introduces Anne to his friend, Captain Harville, and leaves them alone to talk. During their conversation, Harville, who is aware of Anne's fondness for reading, asks her to talk to his friend, Captain Benwick. He says that Captain Benwick is also fond of reading, but has fallen into a depression after his fiancée died. Since Anne is intellectual and considerate, Harville wants her to convince Benwick to move on. He also asks her to talk to Frederick about not leaving the Navy. However, Anne doubts that she can influence him. During dinner that night, Harville and Anne try to persuade Frederick to continue his profession as a Navy captain. However, the latter explains that he wants to marry and have a family of his own. He doesn't want his wife to live in fear for his safety while he's working away at sea. Later, Anne talks to Benwick about a book he's reading and convinces him to step out of his sorrow. Since he's young and the future has a lot to offer him, she suggests he pull himself together and find happiness again. She also reveals that she's been through pain in the last several years, but has always rallied herself. Frederick, who has been listening to Anne's wise words, is impressed, but doesn't show it. In the next scene, while wandering around Lyme, Anne and the group run into a good-looking gentleman who flirts with her. Surprisingly, Frederick doesn't like it and tries to talk to the man, who calmly excuses himself and leaves. That evening, while Anne is alone on the seashore, Frederick arrives and tries to talk to her. He confesses that there's no one like Anne, and he wants her in his life. Moreover, he tells her that during his grim moments at sea, when he felt lost and confused, he always thought about her. He likes how she anticipates the needs of others and is always direct, focused, calm, and thoughtful. Despite confessing his feelings, Frederick can't ask her to marry him. Instead, he offers to be friends. Since Louisa has feelings for Frederick, Anne decides to be just friends with him, sacrificing her love. The next day, Anne meets the good-looking gentleman again at the place they are staying. They have a brief conversation, and he leaves. Later, Anne discovers that he's William Walter Elliot, their cousin. It turns out that William is their father's heir, but he doesn't have a good relationship with him. Being an heir, William will inherit the Baronetcy and the estate. Anne's desperate father wanted him to marry Elizabeth to keep the title within the direct line. However, William turned her down and married an American woman who recently died. Because of all of this, there is a dispute going on between William and Walter. The following day, while roaming around, Louisa asks Frederick to catch her while she jumps from the stairs. He catches her the first time, but when she insists on repeating it, he refuses. Despite his refusal, Louisa jumps off the stairs, falls to the ground, and passes out. Witnessing this, Anne sends Benwick right away to find a doctor. After completing some tests, the doctor concludes that Louisa has suffered a concussion, but will recover soon. When Anne decides to stay to look after Louisa, her lazy sister Mary insists she leave, declaring that she will look after Louisa. This, of course, is an excuse to avoid household chores and mischievous kids at any cost. Before heading home, Anne visits Russell and talks about everything that happened in the last few days. The two talk about William, who is about to visit Anne's father that evening. Since William is richer than Walter and will inherit the title no matter what, Anne suspects he's after something else. Afterwards, she goes to her new house in Bath. Although she has been away for several days, her father and sister aren't excited enough to see her. Rather, they are eager to meet William, thinking of making amends and marrying him to Elizabeth. Soon, William arrives and flirts with Anne, while she introduces herself as his cousin. Later that evening, during a party, William tells Anne that he's more interested in her then her sister Elizabeth. Furthermore, he explains that he's here to stop Walter from marrying Penelope. Rumor has it that Penelope is after him to have a son with him. Thus, William fears that if Walter has a son with Penelope in the future, it will rob William of his title and estate. A few days later, Russell mentions Frederick and Louisa's engagement, which devastates Anne. The following day, Frederick meets Anne at a concert and tells her that he might be leaving for Malta as he has been offered a better position. As the two are talking, they are interrupted by William, who sends Anne away on an errand. Later, Frederick leaves the concert abruptly when he sees Anne and William getting close to each other. Shortly after, William proposes marriage to Anne, but she asks for a few days' time to decide. The next day, Mary and Charles arrive at Bath and ask Anne to come by for a little reunion. Later, the three of them visit Harville and Frederick. Anne learns that Frederick has accepted the offer to go to Malta as a senior Navy officer. Meanwhile, Harville mentions that he is happy that Benwick has found love because of Anne. This surprises and confuses Anne, so Harville reveals that Benwick and Louisa fell in love with each other after the former fetched the doctor and cared for her day and night until she recovered. It turns out it's not Frederick, but Benwick with whom Louisa is getting engaged. Taken aback, Anne turns back to Frederick's table, but he is already gone. However, he has left a letter that says he has never loved anyone but her. He came back to Bath only for her, but was scared to confess his love as he feared being rejected again. Anne breaks down reading the letter and runs towards Frederick. On the way, she sees William kissing Penelope and wishes them happiness. Soon she finds Frederick, embraces him tight, and kisses him. In the last scene, William and Penelope get married, while Anne and Frederick live happily together in Malta.